Welcome back for another episode of Edible Ethics. I'm Jason and I'm with,
Stephanie.
and today we're going to get good and high while talking about dying and death.
I know, right? That's good we're high. So I made sure I got high today for that reason
Yeah, I suspect one of the best reasons to get high is to have these kinds of deep conversations
and to face death.
in particular.
So I took, I have taken usually between 5 milligrams to 7 milligram gummy, usually towards the 5 milligram, but this time I made sure to go closer to the 7 milligrams of THC and 7 milligrams of CBN.
Yeah, so normally people talk about CBD, but this is CBN. This is as you say, a newer kind of interesting thing.
Another cannabinoid. Am I saying the name right?
No, cannabinoid.
That's right. That sounds better. That supposedly reduces inflammation, but really, who knows? How are you high?
Oh, I'm high in a variety of ways. I started about an hour ago with some fast acting gummies.
Nice.
So these are a combination of CBD and THC 1 to 1. They're 10 milligrams each. And the claim on the package is that their onset time is 5 to 15 minutes,
Wow, that's fast.
while their duration is 2 to 4 hours. So instead of waiting around wondering whether I'm getting high, these fast acting gummies will tell you pretty fast you're high or you're not, and you need maybe one more. Or in your case, you need to up the dose from, 5 to 7 or 7 to 10.
Yeah, right. And you found they work?
I do find that there is an immediate or semi
Wow.
immediate onset. Part of it, I suspect, is a placebo effect or an expectation effect, but I'm willing to accept that because I genuinely, authentically feel different after 15 minutes.
There you go. You're high, you're high.
So that's what I started with. And then I went outside and I decided to hit the joint,
Oh, an actual joint.
an actual joint, a pre rolled joint. And this one is a hybrid and it's not a very high quality one. So, by which I mean it's not a brand name one, it's, a shop version. So it doesn't have the same kind of potency as a brand name one would, but it definitely offers me that kind of immediate full body, but also lightheaded in the good way sensation.
Okay, well, we both sound ready then to tackle death.
I do have my pen handy, as Stephanie knows. I like to, well, as repeat listeners know, I like to hit the pen during the course of our recording sometimes to loosen my muscles and get me talking and thinking and so forth. So I have that at the ready, and that has got a high quality hybrid, high potency strain.
Nice.
So would you like me to get us started, Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, you said death and dying, but we're gonna narrow that down a little bit, right? So we're talking specifically about aided dying.
Yeah, exactly. Today we're going to talk about aid in dying, and in particular, because this landscape of even thinking about, let alone talking about, let alone planning for death, is really ethically fraught and complicated. We just really wanted to have a much more specific focus for us today, even though that focus allows us to ask these deeper questions about, what kind of death do I want to have? So let's get started. Medical aid in dying is our topic.
And before we start talking about what we think about this issue, let's talk just briefly about our own deaths.
We have not died.
We have not died. How do you feel about your own death?
I wrote a haiku recently in which I clarified that at some points in my life, I very richly craved my own death, but I don't think I've ever been particularly fearful of it. I'm much more ambivalent about it. I do think that I've got some wishes I'd like to be carried out, but I have not made those wishes clear to anyone really beyond my sister.
I have had, fear around death, sometimes very substantial and painful, that abided somewhat as I grew into adulthood, and then it got better or more manageable to a degree when I had children, because then I was more afraid of them dying than myself.
Okay. Okay, so it didn't exacerbate it by increasing the number of people to worry about to 3. It allowed you to transfer your concern from one person to 2.
Right, because it wasn't like my fear of other people dying is different, for me than my fear of myself dying.
Agreed.
Okay. It was more yes, I replaced it's a bigger fear to witness my own children dying than to die myself, which is, that's a little bit selfish, right? Because I'm saying they are gonna die, whether I'm around to see it or not.
You'd rather they watch you die.
Yeah, so it's, like, again, a little bit selfish, like, I should be there for their deaths, and I'm not like, I'm out of town." So, oh, okay, well, so that I mean, I didn't know that you have not had fear around it.
Yeah, in part because I don't have any dependents, so I have nowhere else to deflect it. I mean, I'm certainly more concerned about my loved ones dying than I am concerned about my own death. So, for instance, any close friends or even, close colleagues, students, former students, I wouldn't want to see anybody pass.
So anyone you're more afraid of anyone in the world dying than you. Like, better you die than a former student? Is that what you're saying?
Not so much better. It's just that my mind is more preoccupied with. If I were to think it through, my mind would be more preoccupied with that than with my own death. It's not that I'm valuing them differently in any sort of conscious way.
I mean, I'm having to start here because I think this is a conversation that often disguises itself as a conversation about ethics and morality when really it's a conversation about mortality and the people and people's feelings about their own deaths.
100%.
So we're going to keep in mind our feelings about mortality as we move through this discussion of medical aid in dying, which is a discussion that happened recently on a national scale in Canada.
So I became aware of the situation in Canada actually somewhat inadvertently. I was giving a lecture to some health professional students about dying and death and about how to elicit conversations with their patients about these very complicated topics. And at the end of the class, one of the students came up to me and said, "What do you think of what's going on in Canada?" And I said, "I have no idea what's going on in Canada." And he pointed me to a statistic from a recent report in Canada indicating that over the course of 2022, there were 13,241 medical aid in dying provisions reported in Canada, accounting for 4.1% of all deaths nationwide.
So we should say Canada recently enacted, not terribly recently, but a few years ago.
Yeah, about 7 years ago.
Oh, 7 years ago, a national medical aid in dying program.
Exactly.
So we have some on the state level here in the US. There's other countries that provide legislatively for aid in dying, but this is a fairly robust example, directly to the north of us.
Exactly. And so what focused on was that 4.1% of all deaths in Canada number, because I had just been presenting on data from Oregon, which is the state that first managed to enact and put into effect a statute permitting death with dignity, is what it's called, but medical aid in dying more broadly. And over the course of the first decade or so of those deaths in Oregon, we're talking about a very small percentage. Even 10 years after the program was established, we're talking about 60 out of 30,000 plus deaths in Oregon, which is 0.002% of the Oregon population. In Canada, 4.1% of the population.
I had heard of what's going on in Canada as well. I didn't hear that statistic, but I had, a number of relatives or Facebook friends, from the right side of the political equation offering some, panicked remarks and commentary on what was happening in Canada.
And in particular, was it this increase year after year of the number of provisions for medical aid in dying that was of concern?
I don't think it was, in response to any particularly statistics, more that there was a lot of kind of right-wing news coverage about the whole program, and that they were essentially, offering it to anyone who came in with, like, a broken ankle or feeling a little sad.
Indeed.
It seems like there's kind of an interesting coalition against medical aid in dying.
Do say more.
I mean, you definitely hear it from the right wing, the political right wing in America, in any case. You hear it from the conservative Christian community,
Which often aligns with the political right, but not always.
but you also hear it from people like disability advocates.
And disability advocates definitely, certainly fall on the left and, potentially far left side of the spectrum compared to how far the right has gone recently. So you're right. There's an interesting amalgamation, what people used to call strange bedfellows.
Let's see what if we can figure out why that is.
Well, typically they give different kinds of reasons for their objections.
What are the objections?
Well, why don't you start with what are the objections?
Well, I mean, this is interesting for me because I mean, I know I hear them.
But they don't resonate?
They don't resonate with me at all. I mean, I mean, I think you get from the left, from the political left, people like disability advocates, concerned that people will be ushered to their death,
Absolutely.
who are coming in a vulnerable state and will be manipulated into thinking that what they need is medical assistance in dying rather than assistance in other areas of their life, even within
Exactly.
the healthcare. Yeah.
Exactly. And there's, for what it's worth, I don't know what the evidence is in favor of that claim, but the presumption in favor of that claim is absolutely dramatic based on anecdotes left, right, and center. Not left, right, and center politically. I mean, from every jurisdiction in which medical aid in dying is practiced. I mean, there are typically very elaborate safeguards put in place to protect against exactly the kinds of abuses that those on the left worry about. Whether those particular safeguards satisfy those on the left is a different question. But for what it's worth, it's not quite clear what kinds of accommodations would satisfy those on the right, because those on the right argue effectively that life in itself is the overriding value. And therefore, we prioritize life over everything. And even though life may be painful and life may be awful and life may be short and brutish and brutal, life is better than death. And therefore, there is never a place for any kind of aid in dying, medical or otherwise. How do you
Eh,
accommodate that view?
which is a I was gonna say something.
By the way, I've hit the pen about 15 times since we started talking.
Yeah, and you're talking in long paragraphs, man.
Yeah, but you know what?
Uh,
This time, my long paragraphs are 100% on track
well, we'll see 'cause I can't track 'em.
because I recognize when they were off track in other episodes, I would say, oh, wait a second, I have no idea what I was. That hasn't happened here. But these paragraphs are 100% decipherable. I'm willing to bet I could put them in logical form for you.
That was half the point. Half the point was that you were not able to keep track of him, and then
Yeah.
but the other half was that was good because we shouldn't be speaking in paragraphs.
I still have that problem, Stephanie. You're right. I know
'Cause you're not the only person that has to keep track of them. Those of listening have to keep track of them.
other people are ought to be my more, important concern.
Okay, wait a minute, let me get my point back. Life about all other. Yeah, I mean, so what's problematic about that for me, one, the reductive view of life that is pure biological, electrical, physical.
Yep, it has nothing to do with aliveness.
So your social life, your emotional life, the experience of life. And the other piece is that's fine if you think your own life, physical, biological life, is the most important value, but you're
Mhm.
telling other people that they're not allowed to do it either.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's because there's this, presumption that capital L life is what matters, not my life or your life, small l.
So I wonder kind of emotionally where they're coming from. Like what is the fear?
They're coming from a place of fear. Fear both for their own mortality, but also fear for their own sort of almost sense that without behaving this way in their earthly life, they won't make it to the promised afterlife.
Perhaps. For me, the thought of For me, the thought that I could get aid, effective aid in choosing the time of my death helps me manage the fear of dying.
Typically when we talk about this as end of life planning or advanced care planning. I think that's the wrong language. I think we ought to describe this as life planning. We are planning our lives, and our lives inevitably include death. Death, it's as Dave Barry once opined, death, it's our biggest killer.
And you have said, which I think is nicely put, that you see this kind of ethical issue aren't about death and dying, they're about death or dying.
Exactly. I think that's the way we ought to think about this. What we're sort of offering the opportunity for with medical assistance in dying is the opportunity to end one's dying process. Yes, simultaneously it ends one's life, but the goal, the ambition, is to end one's dying. Is that ushering in death? Well, in every case, we're talking about inevitable death or just about inevitable death.
Are you suggesting that there is an outcome that is not death? So is there such you keep saying inevitable death. Is there any other kind?
Absolutely, effectively
Oh, can
inevitable.
I get in on that?
So, well, no, because what you'll be experiencing is dying prolonged over a very long period. What you will have experienced is what we're currently offering is a slightly increased lifespan.
No, no, no,
But
no, wait, you didn't get my joke.
damn it, say it again, please.
So are you suggesting there's something other than inevitable death? I was under the impression that death was always inevitable.
I'm not suggesting that.
Okay, because you're talking about inevitable death, getting assistance when
So what you're doing is you're doing a strunken white on me and telling me I ought to eliminate unnecessary words.
no, but it's just
You
kind of
strunken
yeah,
whited me.
death is inevitable for all of us. We
Yeah,
are all slowly dying.
I've got the bumper sticker for you. Death is
We are
inevitable. Prolonged dying is not.
well prolonged because the also the argument can be made is we're all of us slowly dying,
Yes, no, that's true.
but
Uh,
there's a level of suffering when we enter this state where most of us would describe ourselves as dying. There's a
so if you prefer, do you want the better bumper sticker? Death is inevitable, prolonged suffering isn't.
oh, yes, right,
Okay, so
yes.
let's open that store. We'll put a link in the show notes for you to get the bumper sticker, the T-shirt, the buttons, and the mouse pads. Do people still use mouse pads?
Ah, yeah, for sure.
Oh, and totally because of us, we should get some bongs and one hitters that are branded by us that you can get through our online store.
I wanna go back to your sayings. I like both sayings, that what we're doing here is life planning,
Thank you.
because that encourages us to think of
Death as an inevitable part of life.
as an inevitable part of life. And so people, having the right to life as fundamental should include a right to make decisions about the end of that life.
The right to self-determination points in that direction as well.
Yeah, and I like that, it's not death and dying, it's death or dying as well. Even with the caveats like we just described that we're all dying, but
Right.
because it, again, shifts the emphasis off of death and back on this active process of over which we have control, which is dying and dying with dignity. So what you're choosing is your way of dying, and not so much choosing your death. Which I think it goes back to what you were saying that they think, that people that pose it think that life is the highest value. I think also the problem is that for a lot of people, death is the greatest evil.
You make an excellent point there. And it's I think put it in that not just values context, but in that particular context of good versus evil, or virtue versus vice or sin. Yeah, absolutely, there's that.
In fact, it is the greatest sin, right? Because those who are not sinful or absolved of their sin will rise again. So to die is to fail, and it's this shameful thing
Mhm.
about dying that we have. Just so weird because everyone does it.
It is inevitable. And yet,
You lose the battle if you die.
yeah, even though apparently life was the most important value.
Right, right.
Stephanie, usually at this point in the podcast, you turn to me and say, Jason, what do you think is your most important take home from today's discussion? And I'd like to turn the tables on you and ask that question of you.
Oh, you want me to go first, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Oh, man, this has been a difficult conversation for me to keep the thread on, which I guess is good.
Well, I think it has a result. I think it's as a result of your level of highness today.
I think
With that
so.
particular, push toward the 7 rather than the 5, there's a
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah, I've been high before, but I don't know if it's a combination of the subject and the marijuana, but
Whatever I've done today has allowed me to determine that the logic of this conversation is pretty straightforward, except for the 2 places where you said, "Hey, Jason, stop doing that," and you'll just cut that bit out. You won't even have to change the order of anything. Editing this will be as easy as a Sunday morning.
I think you're gonna be very surprised. I think that my biggest takeaway is just still what I went in the conversation with, is that really important before getting into the weeds of talking about an ethical issue like dying and death. It's really important to get an emotion check and try to establish kind of the emotional landscape of this issue on which the ethical landscape.
Absolutely. And I'll admit at times to having a kind of ambivalence toward my own death. I didn't use that language earlier when you asked me.
You
Um,
did actually, you said that exact word.
oh, well, good. So earlier I mentioned that Stephanie has just reminded earlier, I mentioned exactly what I denied just denied mentioning, that what was it? Oh, that I'm ambivalent about my own death. That doesn't mean I feel ambivalent about death in general. And even though I think in general I'm in favor of medical aid in dying with appropriate provisions in place, and I'm not entirely sure what those provisions are yet. I don't have the perfect policy worked out. I forgot the beginning of that sentence slash paragraph.
Your ambivalence towards death, but doesn't towards your own death doesn't mean you're ambivalent toward death.
About death. So the fact that I'm ambivalent toward my own death, as I said earlier, doesn't mean I'm ambivalent about death in particular. Sorry. The fact that I'm ambivalent about my own death doesn't mean I'm ambivalent about death in particular. I'm just not entirely sure what I make of it. It's more undetermined for me yet. I care
So
about it.
what
So I'm not ambivalent. Shush. Are you high or something? I think Stephanie is high today.
uh,
Is a kitten licking your feet or something?
you said a number of times that that you don't care about your own death, just death in general. But you but you said twice, you didn't even get that right, your death in particular. There's like it's like your death, like, who cares? And then there's all the rest of us in particular whose death matters some way.
I don't understand the issue yet, so you should text me later and explain it.
You said you we'll swap in for another word for ambivalent. Just because I don't care about myself dying doesn't mean I don't care about death, which is pretty much saying, like, just because I don't care if I die doesn't mean I'm not concerned with
Yeah.
all of the rest of you.
No, no, no. I think what I was trying to say is just because I don't care about my own death doesn't mean I don't care about capital D death, the
Yeah, but
phenomenon.
that's bizarre. That's bizarre.
No, I'm a philosopher.
That's like saying, like, "'Cause my life doesn't matter at all," doesn't mean I don't care. This is like a total
What you're saying is I care more about the concept of death than I care about my own life.
yes.
Yes, I don't think that's what I'm saying. I think that's your highness.
No, but you
By the way, I do love addressing you as your highness.
like, who else? It's like you lumped everyone all any particular person, because you said death in particular, which meant kinda like any particular person. You care about their life, just
No,
not
no, I
your
said death in general.
own.
I said death in particular when I said it wrong.
You
That
and
was
then you said said it wrong, and then you said it again
that was an outtake. Replay
because
the
you
tape.
are it's funny. So what's your big takeaway?
That if you want to be able to sort of live in the moment, you need to be thinking about the future. And that is the phenomenon that I'm just calling here life planning. And it includes end of life planning. But I don't want us to think about end of life planning as particularly scary because it involves death. I want us to think about end of life planning as part of life planning because it, like death, is inevitably a part of life planning. And life planning offers a phenomenal a phenomenal magisterial sense of autonomy and self-actualization.
Amen.
Hashtag testify.
Hashtag testify. Alright, well, we might have to, come back to this issue at another point.
Oh,
Thank
several
you for
times. In the meantime, I do want to suggest, though, that y'all do something very important, and that's find us on TikTok.
Oh, that's right. We're launched on TikTok under Edible Ethics.
I found it. I'm terrible at TikTok, so y'all ought to be able
Right.
to find it. Please watch the entire videos. If you find them interesting, please watch them all the way through, heart them, follow us, and then tell your friends.
That's right, and we appreciate any reviews or like or follows on your podcast platform of choice as well. That helps people find our little show.
Pass the podcast to the left hand side. Join us in a couple weeks getting good and high. And thank you for joining us today for the same purpose. I'm Jason,
Stephanie.
and we're signing off. Sayonara.